Welcome to my kitchen. Today we're going to be making not only an Italian staple, but something I almost always have in my freezer. Red sauce, gravy, whatever you want to call it. It's quick, not a lot of ingredients, and it is full of flavor. By no means is this a recipe that's been handed down for decades. This is a simple version. It's a nice hearty red sauce that can be used with many things for chicken parm, lasagna, baked ziti, any shape of pasta, or with a nice piece of bread, just to sop it up and enjoy it as a snack. Like I said, not a lot of ingredients. We've got onions, garlic, peppers, 3 cans of tomatoes, Italian seasoning, fresh basil, and this sauce is nice. It doesn't cook all day long. It only cooks for about 30 minutes. There is something that we have to do first before we start cooking. This is an important step. We have to sharpen our knives. This is really important because the sharper your knife, the less likely you are to get hurt. When your knife is nice and sharp, it goes through your ingredients easily. You don't have to worry about the knife slipping because it's not going through. A sharp knife is a safer knife, and that's what it's all about. We want to have fun in the kitchen, so you want to stay safe. So we get the knife sharpened no matter how horrendous it sounds. We'll do that as often as you need to. I try to do it at least every 2 or 3 times I use the knife. So the first thing we're going to start out with is with the onion. I like to use sweet onions. I find that they make me cry less and that they have a milder flavor. The first thing I do is I peel the onions by cutting the ends off. And then I cut through the first layer, and this makes it much easier to peel. So we get that first layer off. Then that way, if there's any blemishes, it comes off with it. These are big onions. I don't use the whole onion. You may need to use 2 onions if you have smaller ones. But you want to use, it's 1.5 cups of chopped onions. Okay, so before we continue with the onions, let's get our oil in our pot so it can start to warm up, so it'll be ready for us to get the onions in there. You want your pot on about a medium-high heat. And that's going to be 2 tablespoons of olive oil. So back to the onions. Okay, I start and I cut the onion in half. And then I cut it in slices. And I find that it makes it a lot easier to control the size of the pieces when you do it that way. At least for me. We don't want real big pieces. What about maybe 1/8 of an inch square? That's a good size. So we get that cut up. And like I said, this is 1.5 cups chopped onions. And then we're going to move on to our pepper after that. Now, I like to use the orange, red, or yellow peppers. They seem to be sweeter. Green peppers, my belly gets upset with green peppers, so I stick to the other colors. And I'm not going to use this whole pepper either. You want 3/4 cup of pepper. You always want more onion than pepper. Pepper is a stronger flavor. So we're going to get this cut up, same size as the onions. There's a lot of different ways that you can cut your pepper. I take the top off, I take the seeds out, and then I slice the pepper. I find it works a lot easier that way. Then you don't have seeds all over your counter. Something too, if you're new at cooking, if you would prefer to cut all your onions, cut all your peppers before you start doing things, that's a great way to get your timing down. until you start to learn how long it takes you to cut up an onion or cut up the peppers. As you learn how long it takes you to do these things, it will make things run a little bit smoother for you. You'll get your rhythm down. You'll be able to judge when things are done cooking, how far along you want your peppers. In this recipe, we don't want them to get too soft. We want them to stay a little bit crunchy when we put the tomatoes in. And this is because they will cook while the sauce is cooking. Remember, the sauce is going to cook for an additional 30 minutes once it's all together. Okay, the oil was getting just a little bit too hot, so I pulled it off the burner. And by putting the onions in there right away, it'll help cool it down. So it is something that, we all lose track of things, but it wasn't too bad. So I just pulled it off. Get something in there to cool it down a little bit and turn the burner down. And then you can finish cutting up your peppers. Things happen. You just have to adjust and go along and don't panic. You get the hang of it. Look, even I made a mistake. So you correct it and you move on. So we're going to get everything in. And that will, again, cool the pan down a little bit. And then you want to make sure that you stir everything really well when you do this, so everything gets coated with the oil, and even just shaking the pan helps. That'll coat everything, and everything will cook evenly. You want to make sure that your pan isn't too high because you don't want things to burn. This is not something that you want to brown at all. You want to take your time and have them soften. You definitely want your pan to be at the right temperature for this next step because we're going to be adding garlic. Garlic can be very tricky. It cooks really fast. Out of nowhere, it goes from perfect to burnt. So you want to pay attention when you're working with your garlic, and you want to take your time. This is where stirring things often becomes very helpful because it gives you a feel for how things are cooking. You can tell how done it is by how soft it is. You can tell if it's sticking to the bottom of the pan, if maybe you need to turn it down a little bit. So this is another reason that you want to get in there and stir your food quite often. Okay, so we're going to get the garlic ready. Get it peeled. You're going to grate the garlic in this recipe. I find it makes it distribute a lot easier because we're not using a whole lot of garlic in this. We don't want to overwhelm it. So, and here's another timing thing. Is once your garlic's peeled, you want to make sure that you open your cans of tomato. Because once your garlic goes in, if for some reason it would be that your pan is too hot and your garlic is cooking too fast, the best way to slow that down is to add your tomatoes. You add your tomatoes and it almost stops the cooking because it, once again, cools the pan down for you. Okay, I'm going to be using 3 cans of 28-ounce crushed tomatoes. You can pick whatever brand you'd like. I usually use the Tutoroso brand, but I'm not able to get that where I'm at. So I gave the Walmart brand a try, the Great Value brand, and they were quite nice. So that worked out well. This recipe is about half of what I normally make when I make a big batch of sauce. So when I do that, I use different textures of tomatoes. I'm using the crushed tomatoes in this one, but they have the diced tomatoes and then they have tomato sauce. So if I'm making a huge pot, I will usually use 3 cans of the crushed, 2 of the diced, and then 1 of just the tomato sauce. So it makes that batch of sauce has a little bit more texture to it. Okay, now that all the cans are open, I'm going to give it a stir, and then I will put in a little bit of salt. That'll help bring out some of the moisture in the vegetables. So that will help them not stick to the pan without putting any extra oil in there. It brings out a little bit of the flavor. So we'll put just a little bit of salt in there at this point. And then we're going to get our garlic in. Like I said, we're going to grate the garlic in so we can get more out of the 2 cloves that we're using. And I don't want the pot too hot. But that's that trick. If you have your tomatoes ready to go in, if for some reason it starts to cook too much, you can just put your tomatoes right in. You want the garlic to cook for about a minute. I wouldn't let it go much more than that. Because just like the onions and the peppers, it's going to cook along with the rest of the sauce. And we'll give that a stir. And I can go ahead and put the Italian seasoning in here. It's just a teaspoon. I don't like to put too many spices in. I like to preserve the flavor of the tomato. And we'll get our tomatoes in. I love that sound. That sizzle when you first pour the can in. Okay, at this point, I'm going to give you a little bit of a different instruction from what you're seeing. I rinse the cans out because I do want to add some water. You're going to put tomato paste in here just to give a little bit of a richer flavor. Now what you want to do is you want to take your tomato paste and you want to put it in one of the cans that you have the water in. And use a whisk and just gently whisk it around until it breaks up the tomato paste and there's no more lumps. It should be nice and smooth at that point. The reason I'm not using the tomato paste here is I have a jar of concentrated tomatoes that my niece sent me from Italy, and I wanted to use that up. So that's what I'm using instead. But you want to use the tomato paste. It's easier to get a hold of. I don't think we can get that concentrate in this country. But I did want to use it up. I didn't want it to go to waste. So that's where your tomato paste comes in. And you want to use about a half a cup of water and about 2 tablespoons of tomato paste. Okay, we're going to give it another good stir here. And then we're going to add the black pepper. And that's a half a teaspoon black pepper. With that much, I think you're safe with a teaspoon. I don't think it will change the spiciness of it at all. Get that in. Next is the sugar. Just a little bit of sugar. It helps mellow out the acid of the tomatoes. And it's about 1.5 tablespoons of sugar. It doesn't make it sweet at all. It just gets rid of the acid. And what's next is the wine. Now, I had some Pinot Noir left over. You can use a Merlot. You want a dark red wine. I didn't have a lot. It was only half a cup. But it adds a richness to the sauce that it really sort of makes it just that much better. If you don't want to use the wine, you don't have to. It's still going to have a good sauce. But we get the wine in there. And then the basil comes next. And this is just a little basil plant I picked up at the supermarket. I was waiting for my basil to grow, so I use this in the meantime. I'm going to take it off, and you want to make sure you wash it. It's a very important step. I've learned from experience. I learned the hard way that if you don't wash your fresh herbs, you can completely ruin the whole dish. Because there is nothing worse than having this food that tastes wonderful and ending up with sand in your mouth or some kind of dirt. So it's a very important step. You want to make sure that you wash everything really well. And I also like to have the basil in smaller pieces. I'm not one to have big pieces. Some people leave the basil whole and just put it in whole, but I do like to have smaller pieces. And so we're just going to get it all chopped up. Doesn't have to be dried off, but it does have to be washed. So we're going to stack it up. Take the bigger stems out. And I just roll it into a ball. Nothing fancy. Get it chopped up. You want to use about 1.5 tablespoons to 2 tablespoons of the fresh basil. If you don't have fresh basil and you would like to use the dried basil, I would start off with just about 1 teaspoon. The dried herbs and spices, they seem to be much stronger, so I would start out with just 1 teaspoon of that and give that a try, and after it's cooked for a little while, you can taste it and see if it has enough flavor for you. Once the basil's in, you're going to give it a good stir. Of course, we want everything well combined at this point because we're going to sit for a while and cook. Like I said, 30 minutes. You don't want it boiling, but you want a nice, slow, steady plop of a bubble. That's what it sounds like. Also, I've discovered that if I take a splatter screen and I put it on top of the pot, it's much better than putting a lid on it. When you put a lid on it, what happens is the steam gets created, and then your sauce can sometimes end up watery. So if you use the splatter screen, it stops it from plopping all over your stove, but it lets the steam out, so it doesn't get watery. This sauce is a perfect way to whip up a great lunch or dinner, or even a snack. And if you have it in your freezer, it'll always be there for an easy meal. I hope you enjoyed this recipe, and I hope you give it a try. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next recipe.